Racist officer shot elderly black man's newborn baby unaware who his baby's father is. Nathaniel Carter was a man who had known hardship, but nothing could prepare him for the agony that awaited him. A former steelworker, his hands were calloused from years of labor, his body weary from the weight of existence as a black man in a town where the law was written against him. Each scar on his knuckles was a story of survival, each gray hair a mark of the battles he had fought against a world that never made space for him. He had spent his years enduring the suffocating weight of systemic oppression, navigating a world that sought to break him at every turn. He had fought through poverty, learned to withstand the cruel indifference of a society that reduced men like him to statistics, numbers that justified policy decisions meant to keep him in his place. He had seen friends and family disappear, swallowed by the iron jaws of a justice system built to consume them, and he had steeled himself against the slow erosion of dignity that came with it. But nothing. Not the years of struggle, not the beatings from officers who sneered as they tightened cuffs around his wrists, not the empty apologies of a world that pretended to care, could have prepared him for the horror that would unfold that night. It was supposed to be a night of joy. His son had just been born, tiny, fragile, perfect. He had counted the fingers and toes, traced the gentle curve of the boy's cheek with the rough pad of his thumb. A warmth he had long forgotten filled his chest, a love so immense that, for a moment, the weight of the world did not matter. The years of injustice, the nights spent looking over his shoulder, the constant battle against a world that viewed him as less than human. All of it faded as he gazed down at the life he had helped create. The child's heartbeat was steady, his breath soft, the rise and fall of his small chest like the whisper of wind through the trees. Nathaniel held the boy in his arms, feeling an overwhelming sense of love that momentarily numbed him to the realities of the world. For once, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something better. His partner, Lisa, rested in the hospital bed, exhaustion softening the edges of her face as she drifted in and out of sleep, unaware that outside those walls, a storm was brewing. The police had been watching Nathaniel for years. They had learned his routines, memorized his movements, marked him as a threat long before he had ever done anything to warrant suspicion. They had arrested him for crimes he never committed, pinned accusations to his name like medals of dishonor. They had beaten him for resisting their tyranny, for daring to raise his voice, for standing his ground when they demanded his submission. He had felt their boots against his ribs, had tasted blood in his mouth more times than he could count, had seen the glee in their eyes as they left him gasping on the pavement. The town's law enforcement did not need a reason to target him. His existence was offense enough, but among them, Officer Travis Miller was the worst. Travis Miller was a man who thrived on cruelty, a man fueled by hate. He prowled the streets with a sneer, his presence a constant reminder of the power he wielded over those he considered beneath him. He carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never faced consequences, who knew that the system would always shield him. To him, black men were nothing more than animals, undeserving of dignity, unworthy of life. He had spent years finding ways to make them suffer. Arrests without cause, beatings without justification, humiliation masked as law enforcement. He wore his authority like a weapon, a shield that protected him from accountability, and he took pleasure in the destruction he left in his wake. And so, when a call came in about a suspicious black man outside the hospital that night, Miller did not hesitate. There was no investigation, no verification of facts, no attempt to understand the situation. The moment he heard the words, he knew what he wanted to do. It was instinctual, a gut reaction born from years of conditioning, from the belief that blackness itself was a crime. He did not ask questions. He did not pause to consider the implications of his actions. He simply reacted, storming into the hospital with his gun drawn, his pulse steady, his mind already made up. Nathaniel had stepped outside for a moment, craving fresh air after hours spent in the suffocating stillness of the hospital room. The night air was crisp against his skin, the quiet hum of the city settling around him like a blanket. He had needed a moment, just a brief respite from the overwhelming emotions that had consumed him. He had thought about the future, about the life he wanted to build for his son, about the ways he would protect him from the world's cruelty. He had made silent promises beneath the moonlight, vows whispered into the darkness, assurances that he would do everything in his power to shield his child from the pain he had endured. Then, before he could fully exhale, the flashing lights appeared. The sound of tires screeching against pavement cut through the silence, and then came the unmistakable crackle of a police radio. Nathaniel turned toward the disturbance, his heartbeat quickening, the weight of years of experience pressing down on him like a heavy chain. He recognized the pattern, the familiar rhythm of an approaching storm. He had seen it too many times before. He had been on the receiving end of it too many times before. But this time was different. This time, his son was just beyond those hospital doors. The door slammed open with force, the sharp metallic clatter echoing through the halls. Miller's voice cut through the air, a bark of authority laced with the sick pleasure of a predator cornering its prey. He ordered Nathaniel to get on the ground, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Nathaniel's hands instinctively lifted, his breath catching in his throat, his body frozen in the familiar grip of fear. He had learned long ago that hesitation could mean death. He had learned to obey, even when he knew he had done nothing wrong. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to plead, but before he could say a word, the gunshot rang out. The hospital window shattered. Glass sprayed across the room, catching the light in sharp, glittering shards. Inside, Lisa stirred, her exhaustion giving way to confusion, her body slow to react. The cry that followed was not her own. It was small, fragile, piercing in its innocence. The bullet had found its mark. Miller had fired without thought, without hesitation, without regret. He had seen movement through the window, a figure wrapped in cloth, too small to register in his mind as anything other than a potential threat. He had not stopped to consider. He had not paused to verify. He had done what he had always done. He had pulled the trigger. What happened next would forever haunt Nathaniel. Nathaniel had stepped outside for a moment, needing air, needing to clear his mind. The weight of exhaustion sat heavy on his shoulders, a dull throbbing settling behind his eyes. Inside the hospital room, his newborn son lay in his mother's arms, swaddled in the warmth of innocence, untouched by the cruelty of the world. But outside, beneath the flickering glow of the parking lot lights, the night was cold and unwelcoming. The hospital parking lot was quiet except for the occasional hum of passing cars, the distant murmur of late-night traffic rolling down the road. The night smelled of damp asphalt and sterilized air, a stillness lingering in the silence. He exhaled slowly, his breath curling into the night, his body unwinding from the tension that had gripped him for hours. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a moment of peace settled over him, thin and fragile like a layer of ice over a deep, endless lake. He barely had time to react when he saw flashing lights, the sudden glow of red and blue streaking across the darkness like a jagged wound. A second later, the screeching of tires shattered the silence, the violent skid of rubber grinding against pavement sending a sharp jolt through his spine. His body tensed, every muscle seizing with the old, familiar instinct of fear. He had lived his entire life knowing what those lights meant, what that sound signified. His mind raced ahead of him, already mapping out the worst possibilities, already anticipating the violence that came with encounters like these. Then the door slammed open. The sharp metallic clang echoed through the air, an iron-fisted punctuation to the intrusion. The moment felt slow and stretched, the space between seconds widening into unbearable chasms. The figure that stepped out was instantly recognizable, his presence so deeply ingrained in Nathaniel's nightmares that it felt as though the past had clawed its way into the present. Officer Travis Miller stood there, a dark silhouette against the pulsing lights, his stance rigid, predatory. The grip on his gun was firm, unwavering, the muzzle already trained with lethal precision. There was no hesitation in his stance, no flicker of doubt in his eyes. Miller's voice thundered through the night, sharp and cruel, each syllable dripping with authority sharpened by years of unchecked power. He barked the command, his words slamming into Nathaniel with the force of a gunshot. The air around them crackled with the unspoken promise of violence. Nathaniel raised his hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a crushing tide. His chest tightened, fear gripping him with an iron fist. His breath hitched, the air thick and unyielding in his throat. His mind scrambled for the right words, for something, anything, that might de-escalate the situation before it spiraled out of control. He barely managed to force out a sound, the first syllables slipping from his tongue in a hoarse whisper. But before he could say another word, a gunshot rang out. The sound split the night open, shattering the fragile stillness that had existed only moments before. The force of it reverberated through Nathaniel's bones, the echo stretching into eternity. His body jerked instinctively, expecting pain, expecting impact. But the bullet had not been meant for him. The cry that followed wasn't his own. A sound so small, so fragile, yet piercing in its devastation cut through the chaos. It was not the wail of protest or the shriek of confusion. It was the sound of agony in its purest form, a newborn's voice breaking beneath the weight of violence too monstrous to comprehend. The noise did not belong in this world, did not belong in this moment. It was unnatural, obscene, the very fabric of reality tearing apart at its seams. Through the hospital room window, Miller had seen movement. His gaze had flickered to the second-floor window, his mind working in the twisted way it always did, conditioned by years of dehumanization, by the relentless beat of suspicion that pulsed through his veins. He had seen a figure, a small, delicate bundle wrapped in cloth, held by a black woman too exhausted to react in time. In his warped perception, in the dark corners of his mind where prejudice festered like rot, he saw nothing but a threat. Without thinking, without questioning, without an ounce of restraint, he fired. The bullet tore through the newborn's tiny body, passing through soft, unblemished skin with brutal efficiency. There was no resistance, no defense, no mercy. It was a life taken before it had truly begun, a future obliterated in the space of a heartbeat. The impact sent a tremor through the fragile form, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wailing ceased. The room erupted in chaos. Lisa's scream shattered the air, a raw, anguished sound that carried with it all the grief of a mother losing her child. The nurses rushed in, their movements frantic, their voices rising in a storm of panic. Alarms blared, the sterile environment of the hospital transforming into a place of horror. The bright, artificial lighting did nothing to soften the gruesome reality that lay before them. Blood, so small yet so devastating, seeped through the blanket, staining the pristine white fabric in deep, crimson streaks. It spread like ink, blooming outward in irreversible destruction. The warmth that had once filled the child's tiny body drained away, leaving behind only stillness, only silence. Nathaniel's knees buckled beneath him, his body sagged, the strength leaching from his limbs, leaving him weightless, hollow. He heard the screams before he saw the horror, the sound reverberating in his skull, each note of agony carving itself into his very soul. His mind refused to process what had happened, refused to bridge the gap between reality and the unthinkable. His vision blurred, his breath caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob, and then he turned toward the window. The sight that met his eyes did not belong to this world. Lisa cradled their son's lifeless body, her face a portrait of devastation. Her hands trembled as she clutched him closer, as if sheer will alone could reverse what had been done. Tears streaked her face, silent and unending, falling onto the motionless form she held against her chest. The weight of what had happened pressed down on Nathaniel, suffocating him, drowning him in grief so profound that his very being seemed to fracture beneath it. The sound that escaped him was inhuman. It was not a cry, not a scream. It was something deeper, something primal, a wail ripped from the core of his existence. It was the sound of a father breaking, of a soul being torn apart at its most fragile seams. Even the night seemed to hold its breath, recoiling from the sheer agony that bled into the air. Miller lowered his gun, the realization of his actions settling over him like a thin veil. But there was no remorse in his eyes, no horror at what he had done. His expression did not change. His body did not tremble with regret. He stood there unmoved, unaffected. His grip on his weapon remained steady, his posture unchanged. He tilted his head slightly, his lips parting, his voice devoid of emotion, of regret, of anything remotely human. He looked suspicious. The words were tossed into the night like discarded trash, weightless, meaningless. They carried no apology, no acknowledgement of the life that had just been stolen. They were a dismissal, a justification, a cold, indifferent shrug at the murder of a child. Nathaniel could do nothing. The world had already decided his pain did not matter. Lisa never spoke again after that night. She wasted away in silence, trapped in an endless nightmare where her child's blood still stained her hands. The world around her continued to move. The hospital staff spoke in hushed tones. The town settled back into its routines, but she remained frozen in that moment, unable to break free from the horror that had consumed her. Her eyes, once full of warmth and quiet determination, became hollow, empty voids staring into a past that could never be undone. She stopped responding to Nathaniel's touch, no longer seeking the comfort of his arms, no longer whispering reassurances in the darkness. Her grief was not something that could be shared. It swallowed her whole, wrapping itself around her like a shroud, suffocating the last remnants of the woman she had once been. She no longer ate, no longer slept. She would sit for hours, her hands trembling as though she could still feel the weight of her son in them, as though the warmth of his tiny body had not yet faded. When Nathaniel spoke, she did not answer. When he wept, she did not blink. Her mind had retreated into a place he could never reach, a place where her child still lived, still breathed, where his laughter echoed through the halls of a future that would never come to pass. Nathaniel buried his son in a grave too small, in a plot of land forgotten by the world. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended only by those who had not yet been beaten into submission by the weight of fear. A few friends from his past, old men who had long since learned the cost of speaking out, came and stood in silence. They had seen this story before, had buried too many children, had watched too many graves dug into earth that would never remember their names. The sky was gray that morning, the air thick with the scent of damp soil and dying leaves. Nathaniel stood over the grave, his body motionless, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails cut into his palms. The coffin was absurdly small, a box meant for a life that had barely begun. The wood was cheap, the funeral home had given him the most affordable option, assuming, rightly, that he could not afford more. The service was brief, the preacher spoke of God's plan, of how all things happened for a reason, but Nathaniel no longer believed in a God who allowed such things to happen. He no longer believed in mercy, in justice, in anything but the cold, hard truth of loss. When the final handful of dirt was tossed onto the grave, when the last murmured condolences faded into silence, he remained standing, staring at the mound of earth that now covered his child. Lisa did not come. She had not left the house since that night, had not acknowledged that there was anything left to mourn. The town did what it always did. The police department issued a statement, "Tragic accident," they called it. The press release was short, clinical, stripped of emotion. They referred to his son as the infant, a nameless casualty, a faceless inconvenience. They offered condolences in the hollow way that institutions did, with words carefully chosen to absolve themselves of any guilt. There was no mention of Miller's history, no reference to the years of brutality he had inflicted on the black community. The report framed the incident as a misunderstanding, an unfortunate mistake, a moment of confusion in a dangerous situation. The town absorbed the story the way it absorbed all things that did not affect its own, with apathy and mild regret, before moving on. No charges were filed. The mayor urged people to move forward, to heal as a community. There were whispers of outrage, murmurs of discontent, but they were fleeting. People knew better than to push too hard. They had seen what happened to those who did. The newspapers barely covered it. A small article, buried beneath stories of local elections and business expansions, summarized the event in a few sentences. The name of the officer was not mentioned. The name of the child was misspelled. The headline described it as an officer-involved shooting, a phrase deliberately designed to obscure responsibility, to create distance between the act and the perpetrator. There was no outcry, no protests, no demands for justice. Another black life lost. Another case dismissed. Nathaniel tried to fight. He stood outside the courthouse, screaming for justice, his voice raw with desperation. He carried a framed picture of his son, the only one he had managed to take before the world stole him away. The image was grainy, taken under dim hospital lights, but it was all he had left. He held it high above his head, forcing people to look, to see what had been taken from him. He stood on the courthouse steps for hours, shouting the name of the son the world had already forgotten. People passed by without stopping, their gazes sliding away, unwilling to meet his eyes. The police stood nearby, watching, waiting for an excuse to make him disappear. He pounded on the doors of politicians who wouldn't even look him in the eye. He met with council members, mayors, officials who spoke in measured tones, who nodded in sympathy while doing nothing. He demanded accountability, demanded that someone, anyone, face the consequences of what had happened. But all he got in return were whispers, whispers that blamed him, that called his son a casualty of circumstance. They told him it was unfortunate, but these things happened. They told him there was nothing more to be done. They told him to go home, to grieve in silence. Some of them did not bother to hide their contempt, their irritation at his persistence. He could see it in their eyes, the way they dismissed his pain as an inconvenience, an obstacle to be maneuvered around. Miller continued to walk the streets, badge still shining, still wearing that same smirk. His uniform remained crisp, untouched by consequence. He returned to work after a brief administrative leave, a paid vacation disguised as punishment. He received a hero's welcome from his fellow officers, pats on the back, murmured reassurances that he had done the right thing. His record remained clean. He was protected, shielded by the same system that had always upheld him. The whispers of outrage faded. The people who had dared to speak out grew quiet. Fear settled back into its rightful place, a familiar shadow cast over the town. Miller had killed a baby and faced nothing but a temporary suspension. To him, it was just another day. He continued to patrol the streets, continued to pull over black men for the crime of existing. He laughed in bars, drank with his fellow officers, made jokes that only they found funny. The weight of his actions did not rest heavy on his conscience because he did not have one. He had always known that the rules did not apply to him, that there would be no punishment, no reckoning. He had been right. Nathaniel had lost everything. He had lost his son, his partner, his hope. He had lost his faith in a world that had never been built for him, in justice that did not exist for men like him. He wandered the streets, a ghost of the man he once was, hollowed out by grief. People avoided him now, as if his pain were contagious, as if acknowledging him meant acknowledging their own complicity. He stopped speaking. He stopped trying. The world had already decided that his loss did not matter. It had already moved on. Months passed, then years. Nathaniel was no longer a man. He was a ghost, haunted by the past, by the cries of a child who never had the chance to live. The world had moved on, indifferent to his suffering, leaving him to drift through the remnants of a life that had already been buried. The weight of grief settled into his bones, turning his movements sluggish, draining him of anything that once made him human. The days blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next, each one suffocating in its emptiness. He stopped working. The factory where he had once labored for hours, his hands stained with grease and sweat, no longer held any meaning. He had tried to return, tried to force his body to move through the motions of survival, but every sound reminded him of that night. The clang of metal against metal, the distant whistle of steam, the sharp echoes of machinery. He found himself frozen, his breath hitching, his vision darkening around the edges until his supervisor's voice cut through the haze, sharp and dismissive, telling him to go home if he couldn't do his job. He never went back. He stopped speaking. There were no words left to say, no audience willing to listen. The world had already buried him alongside his son, had already dismissed his suffering as an unfortunate accident. Lisa had disappeared into herself, wasting away in silence, her presence in the house more of an echo than a living, breathing person. They no longer acknowledged one another, no longer reached for comfort in the dead of night. Nathaniel wandered the house like a ghost, moving through rooms that felt more like tombs, each one filled with reminders of what had been stolen from him. The crib, untouched and dust-covered, remained in the corner of what was supposed to be a nursery. The baby clothes Lisa had so carefully folded weeks before the birth sat in neat stacks, untouched. He could not bear to move them, to pack them away, as if doing so would be an admission that his son had never truly lived. The silence was unbearable, yet he did nothing to break it. Then, one night, something inside him snapped. Nathaniel had spent the day staring at nothing, lost in the prison of his mind, reliving the moment over and over again. He could still hear the gunshot, still see the crimson spreading across the white hospital blanket, still feel the way his knees had given out beneath him. He had tried to block it out, had tried to drink enough to drown the memories, but nothing worked. The pain was a living thing, festering inside him, clawing at his insides, refusing to be ignored. It built inside him, a slow-burning fire, growing hotter with each passing second, until suddenly it was too much. His body moved before his mind fully registered the decision. He reached for his coat, for the gun he had hidden away in the depths of his closet. It was the same gun Miller had used to kill his son. Nathaniel had taken it months ago, stolen from the evidence locker when no one was watching. It had felt right to take it, like reclaiming something that had been used to destroy his world. Now he would return it to its rightful owner. Miller was in a bar, drinking, laughing, celebrating another day of untouchable authority. Nathaniel watched from the shadows, unseen, his fingers tightening around the cold metal of the gun. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the low hum of conversation, the clatter of glasses meeting wooden tables. Miller sat at the center of it all, surrounded by other officers, his laughter sharp and cruel, his presence dominating the room. He was at ease, completely unaware of the eyes watching him from the darkness. Nathaniel remained still, his heart pounding in his chest, though not from fear. He had moved beyond fear, beyond hesitation. He felt nothing but the slow, burning rage that had consumed him for years. No trial would bring justice. No courtroom would punish this monster. Nathaniel knew that now. He had spent too long begging for justice that would never come, standing outside courthouses where doors remained locked, screaming into a void that swallowed his pain whole. The system was not built to punish men like Miller. It was built to protect them. The law had failed him, had failed his son, had failed every black father who had ever been forced to bury a child stolen by men like this. He understood now that there was only one way to end this. As Miller stumbled to his car, he never saw the figure approach. He was too busy fumbling for his keys, too drunk to notice the shadow moving toward him with slow, measured steps. The night air was thick, humid, the kind of suffocating heat that made everything feel heavier. Nathaniel's breathing was steady, his pulse a slow, deliberate beat in his ears. He lifted the gun, his grip firm, his finger resting against the trigger. The first shot shattered Miller's knee, sending him crumbling to the pavement. The impact was immediate, brutal, the force of the bullet splintering bone, tearing through flesh. Miller let out a scream, a raw, animalistic sound, his hands flying to his leg, his fingers slick with blood. His breath came in ragged gasps, shock settling over him as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. His body twisted on the ground, pain contorting his face, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. He tried to reach for his gun, but Nathaniel was faster. The second shot pierced his stomach. Blood poured from his body, spreading across the pavement, pooling beneath him in a dark, viscous stain. His fingers trembled as he clutched at the wound, his body jerking violently as the pain consumed him. He looked into Miller's eyes, into the fear that had replaced the smug confidence, the panic that had replaced the cruelty.